Thanks very much. As speakers did before me, congratulations to Internationalt Forum for 50 years of activity. And thanks very much for the invitation. I should say that I came to this talk a little bit gliding in on a banana peel, as they say in Sweden, which basically means that something happens that wasn't quite expected or planned. So what happened was that with the International Committee of the SAC, we have a kind of a loose collaboration with the Internationalt Forum. So I was planning to attend the event. And a few days ago, I received an email that had the subject line Plan B. And I was told that one of the organizations that was about to present wasn't coming, and if I could do a presentation, to which I happily said yes. Then it turned out that this other organization was going to do their presentation now anyway, at which point, since the organizers here are very kind, I guess they felt it would be rude to disinvite me again. So now I am here giving this talk, hoping, I should say that too, no less for an organization that is much less explicitly anti-imperialist than pretty much all of the other organizations presenting here. With all that being said, I hope that I can contribute something to the debate today, because I think this will probably be the only talk that focuses on labor, which arguably is a central aspect of today's global capitalism and the imperialist order. If you look at I think one of the reasons why labor is rarely discussed in these contexts is that it is a very difficult subject to discuss, because there is a lingering conflict between the internationalism implicit in socialist history, and therefore also implicit in the history of labor unions on the one hand, and the reality that today labor unions mainly organize on a nation-based basis in a world where the conditions for workers in different countries are very, very different. So we had in the first talk today, we had a division into core countries, semi-periphery, and periphery. You could divide these main categories into several subcategories, and everywhere workers struggling for their rights start from very different departure points. So if we take one of thousands of examples that could illustrate this, the Swedish automobile company Volvo has plants in various countries as diverse as Sweden, China, India, Malaysia. If someone had the idea that one and the same labor union would try to negotiate a collective agreement that will give all these workers at these different plants the same rights, it seems outlandish, because the reason that Volvo has these plants in different countries is because the conditions are so different. And this is a problem that labor unions constantly meet. So they, on the one hand, they carry this internationalist principles with them. On the other hand, they first and foremost have to take care of the interests of their members, which are nationally defined. Historically, there have been unions that have been able to organize less on a on a national basis. Now, this is going back to the early stages of the labor union movement, so the late 19th century, the early 20th century. If we use an organization that already by its name indicates that it wasn't nation-based, like the Industrial Workers of the World, which were founded in the United States, but then quickly expanded to countries as far away as New Zealand, South Africa, several European countries, the approach was different. Not only that, but also within the United States, the IWW in the early 20th century organized a very diverse workforce. So of about 20 IWW journals that were published in the United States in the 19-teens, only a handful were in English. All the others were in other languages because they were catering for migrant worker communities. There was none in Danish, but there was one in Swedish, and there was a very big one in Finnish. That history, I'm making this very short, obviously there's not so much time, but that history basically disappeared with a nationalist turn, even within the socialist and the labor movement during World War I, the following periods of fascism, World War II, the social democratization of the labor movement following World War II, also the incorporation of labor unions into state institutions in the so-called Eastern Bloc, and so forth. Syndicalism during that time pretty much lost its momentum, so that even this day, for example, the international syndicalist organizations that still exist aren't, as the IWW was once upon a time, an international organization. It is more a network of, again, nation-based unions. So this would be the same. So these syndicalist organizations that exist, or networks, are fairly small. Obviously, you have enormously big international union organizations. The ITUC would be the biggest one, organizing millions of workers around the world. Yet, as I think most people here would agree, I guess some might have never heard of the ITUC. It is not a huge factor in international politics, which is based on the fact that those organizations mainly nowadays facilitate communication and exchange of ideas and information between different unions. There's a very strong domination of unions in the global north. It is very difficult, even within these more formal networks or organizations, to really establish even common campaigns, let alone some kind of common front against the imperialist order. Another aspect that I should mention when we talk about labor unions and anti-imperialism is the role that labor unions have played in national liberation struggles connected to a broader anti-imperialist struggle. Again, very short. Unsurprisingly, those roles were very different from country to country because the state of the labor movement and their organizations was very different. So there are examples. South Africa stands out, where labor unions played a very, very significant role in the liberation struggles. In the liberation struggle, many others didn't have any organized labor, so they weren't playing a big role. Others had organized labor, but it was fairly weak. One thing that should also be said, though, which is interesting if you look at labor unions, I mentioned the incorporation of labor unions into state institutions in what you might call authoritarian governments in a very general sense. And for example, you have unions that were incorporated into national bourgeoisie governments in the global south, that despite that were able to be a base for resistance to those regimes, because anywhere you go, especially also in countries in the global south that are integrated into the imperialist order through a national bourgeoisie, labor is at the core of the struggles there as well. So if you look at an example like Tunisia, although the General Trade Union, their association, was state-controlled, it always had grassroots resistance, which during the so-called Arab Spring was an important factor in the struggles that happened in that country. So if you look at anti-imperialist resistance from a labor perspective, those examples are important to have in mind. Now, based on all this, what is the role that an organization such as the SAC, as a syndicalist union in Sweden, can do or play? I should say here, well, there are probably two disclaimers before I say more about the SAC. One is something that I already mentioned before, or that the SAC it's a labor union. That is its main purpose. It is not an anti-imperialist organization. It has, however, an international committee, which I am a member of, which tries to pursue labor struggles from an internationalist perspective. There is no, as that was one of the questions that was posed by the organizers to all of the presenters, there is no anti-imperialist line or analysis as such that I could present here as the line or analysis of my organization. We don't have that. What we do have, again, is an international committee that tries to work along those lines. However, even there, I cannot claim that analysis of the imperialist system would be a big part of our work. So essentially, to answer that question, is that the analysis doesn't go any further to what is implied in the syndicalist origins, which is that labor is at the heart of the anti-capitalist struggle, which also means that it is at the heart of the anti-imperialist struggle, which can only be led internationally. So that's as far as we get there. There was another question which which asked why we prioritize the struggles that we prioritize, I believe. And the answer there is, it's almost a tautology. We prioritize labor struggles because we are a labor union, and that's what labor unions do. So it doesn't really go any further than that, although I think that most people, at least that's true for me, I mean, there are other choices where you could organize or be active. I think most people who do that kind of work in our international committee do it because they see labor as an essential part of that struggle. Other than that, maybe I've mentioned syndicalism a few times, and just yesterday someone asked me what syndicalism is, and I also said that even today, even though we have still these principles of internationalism, anti-international committee that tries to work along those lines, I mean, we have factions within the SAC of people who are completely uninterested in the international work because they want to organize workers in Sweden and be an alternative to mainstream unions. So in what way are we an alternative, or in what way are we different from mainstream unions? I think that'd be three main principles that are true for all syndicalist unions. One, it's a rank and file organization. So a very simple example, if there's a strike, it's not there's no leadership that decides on whether you go on strike or not, and there are also no prolonged referendums at different workplaces to decide whether you have majority opinion to go on strike or not. If there is a certain group of workers that's at a workplace and there are members and they want to go on strike, they will be supported by the rest of the organization. It's not more complicated than that. So that's one. The other one is that the means of industrial action tend to be more radical than those of mainstream unions. So there are blockades, there are strikes quite often. Even though the SAC is a small labor union relatively in Sweden compared to the others, there are many years where the combined strike days of workers belonging to a particular labor union is led by the SAC. So SAC members would combined have more strike days per year with 3,000 members than unions with 100,000 members. For people who have a Nordic interest in Nordic labor politics, the only comparable union in Sweden would be the Dock Workers Union, which is an independent union from the main labor organization, which we have good contacts with. So they also have many strike days per year. And the third difference to main unions which is also related again, I guess, to the internationalism and the anti-imperialist struggle, is that in our constitution, the explicit goal of the union is to help facilitate the end of capitalism and, as it's called in our constitution, libertarian socialism. So that was the first disclaimer. The second disclaimer is because I want to close now with concrete examples of what we actually do based on everything I've said until now. Torkil said something, I think, in his opening words to the conference about the fact that small struggles aren't necessarily insignificant struggles. So that it was nice because it certainly applies to us. So I mean, we talk about very big things, the end of capitalism and the imperialist system and all of that. The practical examples that I have to offer are comparatively small. However, I mean, we're a relatively small organization. We could do much more than what we do, but we do certain things. And although they are fairly small, I do believe, otherwise I wouldn't be involved in the work, that if those examples could be amplified and multiplied, they could make a more significant difference in the capitalist imperialist order than what we ourselves can do. And obviously we are not the only ones doing that kind of stuff. Fortunately enough, other people do similar things and often much better. So we represent a broader movement in that sense. When I speak about concrete examples, I would divide them up in two fields, kind of following what I said about the IWW early on. So on the one hand, the actual international work, and then on the other hand, the work that is done in Sweden, but from an internationalist perspective. So the international work, there are a few surprises here. So one thing that we try to do is identify radical grassroots unions. Whether they call themselves syndicalist or not doesn't matter, but they operate on similar principles in the Global South, who we then not only support in the sense that we'll send money there, but try to establish an actual collaboration along the lines of what's today called the global chains of production and distribution. So the probably best example is the collaboration we have with a labor union in South Africa called KUSABU, which mainly works in the agricultural business. The way that relationship was established is that they organize vineyard workers in South Africa who produce wines that are sold at Systembolaget in Sweden, which is the state-owned company that has the monopoly on alcohol sales. And we have a workplace section at Systembolaget. And about 10 years ago, there were strikes at the vineyards in South Africa. And so in support of those strikes, there was a campaign done by our workplace section at Systembolaget, and they were pressuring Systembolaget to get involved and put pressure on the producers in South Africa, so that basically saying that, you know, if you don't give in to those demands by your workers, we're not going to sell your wines at Systembolaget. And out of that, so that was the beginning, and out of that came a collaboration with that union that consisted of several visits back and forth. There was a book published. There was when some of our workers at Systembolaget then had problems with union busting because they were, Systembolaget wasn't happy with their activities. There were solidarity actions done in South Africa. So it was a nice kind of collaboration that went beyond just a one-sided, a rich global North labor union relatively gives some money to labor unions in the Global South, which is great, but it's even better if it goes beyond that. Other things we do is that we do support more in this traditional manner of providing material support to broader labor campaigns in the Global South. So also then often in collaboration with other labor unions in Europe. So one example from last year was support for a strike wave in Bangladesh of garment workers, which was prolonged for months, and so their material support was important to fill their strike funds, basically, so that they'd be able to maintain those strikes. So we were involved in that, and that ended in a victory for those workers. So that was nice. There are other examples, but that one stands out. And the third example concerning the internationalist work, and that again connects more to political anti-imperialist struggles, is that we try to establish, it's not always easy, but try to establish contacts with grassroots unions in regions where we see an important political struggle happening. So for example, in recent years in Kurdistan. There's also other things that we do, like the Zapatista tour has been mentioned here today a couple of times. There was also a delegation visiting Sweden, so we get involved. This, I can also, as a footnote, become sort of a stretch. There are some people within the union who think that, oh, it's a great thing that they're coming, but it's not really labor related, so why are you getting involved? We get involved anyway, but that's where some of these sort of more problematic discussions start about what it actually is that a labor union should do, and where it just becomes a political struggle that other organizations take care of. But anyway, so this is the international work. What's also important to me, and perhaps that also relates to some kind, and not only to me, to parts, other people in our organization, and I guess that also relates in some way to an anti-imperialist analysis, is that we do a lot of work around organizing migrant workers in Sweden. And why that seems important is because migrant labor today is at the crossroads of the global capitalist order as it functions today, but also questions that are of big political importance, such as citizenship, structural racism. A lot of factors play into it. So I see that as a very crucial factor in politics. You might say revolutionary politics, probably globally, but certainly in Europe today. So one thing, a basic thing, for example, and that's also based on the syndicalist principles. That was in the old days. Now I'm referencing the IWW once again. There was a kind of slogan that described their work in the early 20th century, which was about organizing the unorganizable. So basically, laborers, even at that time in the U.S., so migrant laborers within the U.S., so people that were moving from place to place, that weren't working at a certain factory where they could establish a workplace section. So people that, even at the time, other trade labor unions had a hard time kind of fitting into their organizational model. And so the IWW developed different ways of organizing those folks. And so a sort of a current comparison is to organize undocumented workers. It's very difficult because they're undocumented. Now, I can say a lot of very critical things about the SAC. I think one thing that you can arguably sort of be proud of if you're part of the organization is that the SAC has been a pioneer in organizing undocumented workers in Sweden. So when that started about 15, 16 years ago, really none of the bigger unions did that. It has changed because there's been pressure coming from the SAC. So basically, so that's one thing. We organize anybody. Another thing is that based on that, it has, the organization of migrant workers has generally become a focus, at least of certain locals of the SAC. So in Skåne, for example, there are agricultural migrant workers that have built workplace sections in connection with the SAC locals. In Stockholm, it's mainly in construction that we have a high membership of migrant workers. In connection with that, there has also been, we have people who work undercover, again in both sectors, agriculture, if you want to include berry picking in the far north in the summer into that, as well as in construction. So there are people who are members who work there under false identities to identify all of the, I mean, there's a long list of basically just criminal activity that's happening in those sectors. So this is something that we do, and then obviously try to use that that information to improve the situation of workers and put pressure on employers. We've also experimenting, which has been very successful from my perspective, with ways that means that aren't traditionally means of trade unions, and are more in line with what's called workers' centers in the United States. So these aren't unions, but these are places where workers can go to get legal advice, help if they want to do wildcat strikes or other industrial action. So we have established, there's especially one in Stockholm, in Husby, in the north of Stockholm. Husby is one of the notorious migrant suburbs. That's, I guess here it would be a ghettoområde. And so basically it started, so not as a place where people would have to go and then have to join the union to get help, but we were there with some other organizations to provide help, so to speak, regardless, mainly advice. However, also explaining to people that, for example, if they wanted to take action at their workplace and they were unorganized, or as is often the case, there are actually members of mainstream unions which don't want them to get active because they have a collective agreement with the employer and don't want to get into trouble. So we tell them that if they want to get active and feel that the unions they belong to now stand in the way of that, that if they want to join the SAC, that they would get that support. And the probably most prominent example is that out of that what we don't call it the worker center for different reasons, it's called a social center. But what out of that came what arguably was, I don't know the biggest, but one of the biggest workplace struggles in Sweden this year at a Zalando factory. I don't know if people here buy clothes from Zalando, but Zalando is one of these big new internet retail companies focusing on clothing, based in Germany, and they built this super modern, you have like robots running around collecting clothes, distribution center in the north of Stockholm as their Scandinavian hub. And the workforce there is mainly a migrant workforce. And it's kind of, I mean, you've heard the stories about Amazon and stuff. It's similar working conditions there. And most of those actually, because there is a collective agreement with Handels, which is one of the main stream unions in Sweden, and despite workers regularly coming with complaints to the unions didn't really want to do, the union didn't really want to do anything, and so a few of those people showed up at that worker center or social center we have in Husby, and then decided to become members and take action, and within a few months they were able to recruit more than half of the permanent workforce at Zalando to the SAC, which obviously provides a whole different leverage for their complaints and their struggles there. So this has been probably the biggest success in terms of measurable labor organizing successes in what concerns migrant workers we've had last year. There is one, this is the last example that I'm mentioning, and it's very, very new. The project hasn't even been launched yet. It is planned to be launched in January, which kind of tries to combine these two things, so the international work and the national work, because obviously one problem with organizing migrant workers is also that they often, and increasingly so, move between different countries and move across borders. So especially transport workers like truck drivers, also construction workers, which are kind of shuffled around different European countries. And they're often only in one country for a few months and then they move on. And so even, for example, if they became members within the SAC, and some of them do, but then 2 months later they are sent off to some project in Germany. And so in order to facilitate a more continuous organization or possibility of organization of these workers, we have established a network of both labor unions, grassroots unions,